And interestingly, there's been over 500 confessions to the Black Dahlia murders over the years, including numerous confessions from people who weren't even born yet at the time the murder was committed. Hello, and welcome back to Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Sorry it's been so long since we did one of these. I've had a lot of personal things going on recently, but hopefully those are all resolved now, and we'll be back to some sort of regular schedule here. With that said, I did recently get engaged, so the future Mrs. Fridays and I are doing wedding planning right now, so more delays may be incoming. Anyways, this week we're looking at the 13th episode of Season 2, entitled Retirement is Murder. This episode originally aired on January 10th, 1995, and has production code 213, which is the last episode we'll have in production code order for a while. This is our second episode of 1995 and attracted 21.1 million viewers. This is a decline of 3 million viewers from last week's outing, but is good enough to be right on the average rating for the season. Seinfeld is off this week, but Friends still manages to beat Frasier for the second time this year, with a 24 million viewer rating. This is a drop of 2.6 million viewers from the prior week, so a similar, if slightly smaller decline than Frasier sees here. Retirement is Murder is Alan Myerson's directorial debut on the series, and his only time to act as a director on Frasier. Myerson is a pretty interesting choice to direct an episode of Frasier. He was born in 1940, and in 1963 founded the comedy troupe The Committee. From there, he found a lot of success as a comedy director, starting with an episode of the John Bartholomew Tucker Show in 1966, before landing jobs on The Bob Newhart Show, The Love Boat, Welcome Back Kotter, Delta House, Bad News Bears, Harper Valley PTA, Knight Rider, Miami Vice, Baywatch, Friends, Larry Sanders, Lizzie McGuire, and Joan of Arcadia. Interestingly, despite his lengthy resume, the only show he stayed on to direct more than 8 episodes of is Laverne and Shirley and Boy Meets World, which he directed 12 and 16 episodes of respectively. He retired from directing in 2005, without ever winning an Emmy, although he did receive a nomination for his direction on The Larry Sanders Show. Myerson isn't the only new hand we have this week on Frasier. We also have 2 new writers joining the team for their first outing, and that's Elias Davis and David Pollock. Where Myerson was in the middle to end of his career with this episode, this is near the very end of this writing pair's career. In fact, with the exception of one more episode later this season, this is the last thing the pair will ever write. The pair started out writing with a 1968 episode of The Monkees. From there, they do 1 or 2 episode stints on a lot of big-name comedies from the 70s and 80s, including The Mary Tyler Moore Show, The New Dick Van Dyke Show, The Carol Burnett Show, which they wrote 24 episodes of, One Day at a Time, MASH, a single episode of Cheers. This was the Season 8 episode entitled For Real Men Only, Growing Pains, and Full House. Despite fading into retirement after their 2 episodes of Frasier, the 2 have contributed a ton to the 70s and 80s comedy scene. And perhaps most interestingly, they were the duo selected to write the finale episode of MASH. We start our episode out with an intro I didn't think we'd be seeing this season, and that's the Nothing Happening intro. This is its 6th appearance overall, but its first one for the season. It last showed up in the 23rd episode of the first season, and with its appearance here, it becomes the 8th different introduction we've seen thus far this season. We start out with a scene of Daphne and Martin looking over one of Martin's old cases. Well, not just any of his old cases, but the Weeping Lotus case, which is the same case we saw Daphne and Martin working on for the first time way back in Season 1, Episode 4, I Hate Frasier Crane, where Martin was asking if Daphne had any psychic readings regarding the case. We've had a few other references to it throughout the series so far, and it's the case that's really bothered Martin that he wasn't able to solve it during his time on the force. It's his white whale. It's a tired old trope we've seen a ton of times. Heck, it seems like half the Hieronymus Bosch books use this plot line for the cases Harry works on. With that said, it works great in police and detective stories, and it works well enough for this sitcom episode. The Weeping Lotus case is fictional, but it is almost certainly a fictionalized version of the Black Dahlia murder. The Dahlia murder is the 1947 murder of waitress Elizabeth Short in LA. She was a Boston native who moved to LA. There's cultural belief that she moved to LA because she was an aspiring actress, but there's no actual evidence that this was the case. She never had any acting jobs during her time there, and only seemed to have worked as a waitress. The case itself still remains unsolved to this day. During its investigation, the LAPD fielded over 150 suspects in their attempt to solve the murder, but they never did. I'm not going to go into the details of the murder, as it's quite gruesome, and you can easily find them yourself if that's something you want to look into, but suffice it to say, it was much more graphic than what is described in this episode. There's been, obviously, a ton of theories as to who the killer was. And interestingly, there's been over 500 confessions to the Black Dahlia murders over the years, including numerous confessions from people who weren't even born yet at the time the murder was committed. Frasier attempts to get Daphne and Martin to go out for a walk with him because it's a beautiful night out, but they both decline because they want to keep working on the grisly murder. Eddie does show up to take a walk with Frasier, and outside of an eye roll towards Eddie, Frasier doesn't make any quibbles about taking him for a walk. I'm really glad Frasier and Eddie have grown to be, at the very worst, frenemies at this point, if not outright friends. And ironically, at this point in the show, I think we've seen more growth between their relationship than we have between any other characters. Our guest caller this week is Mary Steenburgen. Steenburgen was already a major movie star by the time this episode came out, and that hasn't changed in the last 30 years. Steenburgen got her acting start in 1978 after running into Jack Nicholson in a reception room at Paramount's New York office. He requested her to be cast as the female lead in his 1978 film, Goin' South. From there, she went on to appear in Time After Time, for which she won a Saturn Award, and met her future husband, Malcolm McDowell. In her third film appearance, Melvin and Howard, she won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. From there, she'd go on to appear in a number of well-reviewed and well-received films, including Back to the Future Part 3, What's Eating Gilbert Grape, Step Brothers, and The Help. She's also appeared in a lot of TV shows, as both a voice actress and an actor. Starting with Fairy Tale Theater in 1983, Back to the Future, Inc., Law and Order, Becker, Joan of Arcadia, Justified, Orange is the New Black, Curb Your Enthusiasm, On Becoming a God in Central Florida, which was an excellent show that got canceled because of 2020, and I'm still a little bitter we won't see a proper conclusion to, and Bless the Hearts. Steenburgen divorced McDowell in 1990, and 5 years later married Cheers and Frasier alumni Ted Danson. And they're still married today. Steenburgen was also inducted into the Arkansas Women's Hall of Fame in 2018. This episode takes place directly after last week's episode, and Roz's distaste for Bulldog from that encounter is still very highly on display, as he hits on her here. It's a nice bit of continuity that, even if it's not a direct reference to what happened last week, shows that there's now some animosity between them, and makes for a really nice addition to this episode. Niles shows up at the radio station to visit Frasier this week, and he and Bulldog meet on screen for the first time. Not only is this their first on-screen meeting, but apparently it's their first ever meeting, based on the dialogue we have here. It's funny, but I don't think it makes much sense. We know Bulldog has been over to Frasier's apartment before, which, okay, that doesn't guarantee anything regarding Niles and Bulldog meeting. But remember, Niles also filled in for Frasier on the radio when he was off. Bulldog has come into the studio numerous times after Frasier finishes his show to start his own show. And I just find it extremely hard to believe that Niles and Bulldog wouldn't have crossed paths at some point during that time. I have one more quick thing to call out before we leave the studio, and that's this poster. It's a new one we haven't seen before, and it's Chopper Dave. Dave is played by Richard Poe, and only appeared in 2 episodes in the first season. Unlike Noel, Bulldog, and Gil, his character didn't end up sticking around. Given it's already been over a year since he's been on the show, I found it both surprising and interesting that he's on the poster in the background in this scene, even if he doesn't appear in the series again. This little tidbit makes it feel like he's still around. Our next scene finds the brothers taking their father to a basketball game to take his mind off the murder case. And much like Bulldog and Niles' meeting earlier, I'm not sure how much sense it makes. On Cheers, Frasier was married to Lilith by the point of the series that they started to leave the bar and the boys started going to sporting events a lot. But it doesn't mean he didn't talk sports with them. I know he did. And by the end of the series, he was as much a regular sports guy as Norman Cliff. And even if he didn't have exactly the same interest, he had enough that he wouldn't have embarrassed himself with the sports conversation. With that said, the Frasier we see here doesn't understand the first thing about basketball, which just doesn't jive with what we saw on Cheers. Again, it's a minor quibble, but coupled with the Bulldog and Niles scene, it makes me wonder how well Davis and Pollock paid attention to the show continuity in their outings. In Davis and Pollock's defense, they did some wonderful characterization on Niles. He comments that he can't go to the bathroom at a communal urinal because he has shy kidneys. This is a great Niles line, and actually one of the better lines in the episode. We also get a really good physical gag with some excellent grammar chewing of the scenery, when Frasier does the wave while Niles and Martin remain seated. Martin's slightly agitated look, coupled with Frasier's excitement, made this an excellent scene and just excellent acting all around. The basketball team the Cranes went to see are the Seattle Supersonics, which are more commonly known as the Sonics. This reference becomes kind of interesting because the team doesn't exist anymore. The team originally formed in 1967 and was initially part of the NBA's Western Division. 3 years later, they became part of the Pacific Division, where they remained until 2004, when the division was again renamed as the Northwest Division. Interestingly, they weren't part of the Northwest Division very long, because in 2008, the team was sold to Oklahoma and renamed the Oklahoma City Thunder. Another interesting tidbit here is that the arena they're playing in is most likely the Tacoma Dome. The Tacoma Dome was only used in the 1994 and 1995 seasons because the Sonics' regular arena, the Key Arena, was undergoing construction. It is worth mentioning that the King Dome from 1978 to 1985, when they were at the peak of their popularity, so they could sit more fans. Both the home arena and the name of the team makes this basketball game a much more interesting piece of sports history than one that was just a fictional team could have been. One other thing I want to touch on real quickly before we move out of this scene is we learn what Niles is listening to while he watches the game. And it's a soundtrack to West Side Story. When we saw Niles was listening to something, I would have assumed it was either some dissertation or an opera, as we know both him and Frasier are big fans of the opera. Instead, we learn that what he's listening to is one of Stephen Sondheimer's most famous musicals. The show originally premiered in 1957 and was nominated for 6 Tony Awards and won 2 of them. There's no denying it was a huge hit and made a huge cultural impact. Heck, in 1961, a mere 4 years after the Broadway premiere, the film adaptation of it appeared and went on to win 10 Oscars, including Best Picture. I say all this to say I didn't expect this to be something Niles would be into. He's usually much less interested in something this mainstream and pedestrian. Of course, Frasier made a Beavis and Butthead reference, so who am I to judge? The fan who asks Niles what he's listening to doesn't receive a name, but does receive an acting credit. The actor here is Rand Kovitz. Kovitz is a bit of a "that guy who was in that thing" actor. He got his start in the 1978 George Romero classic, The Dawn of the Dead, where he played a cop. From there, he's appeared in quite a few TV shows, including The Young and the Restless, Hill Street Blues, Home Improvement, L.A. Law, Beverly Hills, 90210, ER, The King of Queens, The Tick, The Following, and Archive 81. He's also one of our first guest stars to have a substantial history as a stuntman, starting with the 1991 Addams Family, and continuing through today, he's acted as a stunt coordinator or choreographer in nearly 20 films, which is a really cool and different job, and something we don't think of much outside of Jackie Chan and Tom Cruise. As the episode moves into the actual meat that will fill out the rest of its runtime, Frasier decides he wants to take a look at the cold case and see if he can come up with anything his father missed. He asks Daphne to refresh his memory and give him a rundown on the case. It turns out one of the suspects was a man who trained apes and had a show in Vegas. Daphne comments that the apes opened for Engelbert Humperdinck. Unlike a good number of the books and restaurants in the show, this turns out to be a real-world reference. Humperdinck, whose real name is Arnold George Dorsey, was an easy-listening /pop singer who was really big in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He started as a stage performer in 1956, and in 1965 released several ballads that topped the UK charts. From there, he saw a lot of success throughout the 1970s. Starting in the 80s and the early 90s, he lost some of his popularity, but he found a second lease on his career in 1996, when he recorded the song for the Beavis and Butthead Do America soundtrack entitled Lesbian Seagull. Since then, he's continued to keep busy, including working on a Grammy-nominated gospel album in 2003. As of 2024, he's sold more than 140 million albums, and in May of this year, he embarked on his Grand Farewell Tour. Then, while discussing a very real Edgar Allan Poe story, Frasier makes a deductive leap to the identity of the killer. Now, I'm not sure if I should be praising the writers here for setting it up really well so Frasier's reasoning was really easy to follow, or if I should be criticizing it because Frasier's deductive leap was really obvious and I saw where the entire rest of the episode was going as soon as they mentioned the monkey. But I will leave that up to you to decide. Our next scene brings us to a really good Britishism from Daphne. She says she hasn't seen Martin since he knocked her up this morning. Frasier turns and gives her a very strange look. We all know what it means in the American context, and a moment later, Daphne explains that the British version of the term is used for waking people up by knocking on their door. I'd never heard this before, but it turns out this is a real term, and makes for a really good joke here. Ron Dean's Frank drops by to talk to Martin about his theory of the case. This is Dean's second of 3 appearances on the show. He first showed up in the 15th episode of Season 1 as one of Martin's poker buddies, and he'll make his final appearance in the series in Season 5. We get to meet a whole slew of cops from Martin's force when they come to congratulate him on cracking the case. Most of them aren't credited, although 2 of them are. The first is Bill Grafton's Leo, who first showed up in the episode Dukes, We Hardly Knew Ye. He is making his second of 3 appearances here. The other credited cop, Al, is played by Heath Porter, who is making his first and only appearance on the series. Porter is an extremely minor actor with only 7 credits to his name, including a 7-episode stint on Days of Our Lives, an episode of Dynasty, and an episode of Hotel. This episode of Frasier serves as his final outing in the acting world. As the episode winds down, we get some good monkey puns when Frasier's confusion is revealed to all Martin's cop buddies. Frasier tries to join in on the fun, and to the understanding of absolutely no one, says Clarence Darrow could have been the monkey's lawyer. Darrow is a lawyer from Ohio who was active from the 1870s until the 1930s. During that time, he represented a lot of cases, but most notable, and what Frasier is referencing here, is the Scopes monkey trial. This case ran for 2 weeks in July of 1925, and was a case of the state of Tennessee suing a teacher named John Scopes for teaching the theory of evolution after it had been outlawed. Scopes actually incriminated himself to bring the case publicity and make a public spectacle of it. Darrow acted as his attorney. Ultimately, Scopes lost and was fined $100, although the case was overturned on a technicality. This technicality was the judge set the fine instead of the jury, which was against the law at the time if the fine was greater than $50. A film and play loosely retelling this legal tale was released in 1960 called Inherit the Wind. Frasier makes reference to Inherit the Wind, where he incorrectly identifies it as a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel instead of a play. The best part of this joke isn't the interesting history behind it, but Martin's extremely confused reaction to it. Martin's reactions of complete bafflement to things his sons say is quickly becoming some of my favorite things John Mahoney does in the series. Finally, we get the perfect coda for this episode, with Eddie acting as a killer in Daphne's murder. It's really cute, really funny, and a great use of all the characters. As much as I felt the second half of this episode was extremely obvious, I found this coda to just be perfect and just unexpected enough to be the ideal way to wrap up an episode about solving a murder. We're pretty light on ties this week, because pretty much the whole episode takes place in the space of a day and a half. Frasier sports 2 different ties, while Niles only has 1. Frasier's first tie is a Thanksgiving tie, making its 8th appearance. After last showing up, just last week during the montage sequence. And Frasier's second tie is a new one and a little less abstract than his standard one, featuring a golden leaf flower design that reminds me of Chinese restaurants. For Niall's part, he's also wearing a new tie, which feels more in brand with his Season 1 ties as opposed to the chicken ones he's sported several times this season. This brings us up to 42 to 41 ties, with Frasier still slightly in the lead. This episode is a bit all over the place. There's some great bits, like the coda, and the scene of Bulldog and Niles meeting for the first time, even if I don't think it fully makes sense, since Niles has worked at the station before. The acting from our principal cast is, as always, top-notch, with Martin being maybe the best of the bunch this time out, between his confused reactions to Frasier's jokes and his obsessive behavior with the case. All the guest stars are fine, although none of them have large enough parts to really cause any risk to the episode if they didn't act well. With all that said, the whole second half of this episode doesn't offer much. To anyone who's familiar with sitcoms, it was really obvious it was going for a classic misunderstanding storyline. And it played out just fine, but there wasn't anything exceptional there. It's nice we got the Weeping Lotus case all finished up finally, and it's nice to see the continuity of the same cop friends of Martin showing up again. There's just not much else this episode had to offer. Overall, Retirement is Murder is a nice 6.5 out of 10 episode of Frasier. But I'm not upset we won't see much more of this writing and directing team